Good morning. Okay, the great queens of the Atlantic. They almost didn't happen. I'll tell you the story. A few days ago, I spoke about the great French liner Normandy, the first incredible superliner ever to go to sea of over 1,000 feet in length. I'm never quite sure why it was an iconic measurement, but shipping companies, especially transatlantic fast ship, who owned the greatest, fastest ship, always thought if they could build a ship of over 1,000 feet in length, it would be something remarkable. They never had the technology available until the mid-1920s and early 1930s. And remarkably, at the same time, or at a similar time, without any collusion between them, three great shipping companies came to the conclusion that it was time to build a 1,000-foot ship. If you built a ship of that length, obviously it has to be very broad, at least 110, 115 feet wide. It would need to be extremely powerful, and this was their aim. The three companies at the same time that decided to build such a ship were the White Star Line of Britain, the Cunard Steamship Company of Britain, and the French Line. The French Line, in fact, became the very first ship to enter service with a great liner of 1,000 feet in length, and she was Normandy. The French Line were lucky inasmuch as money was no object. And as I mentioned a few days ago, Normandy was to be the ship of France, their symbol afloat, and it was financed by the French government. Not so the other two great companies that were thinking of doing the same thing. The White Star Line very soon decided that this was going to be far too expensive. They may not even fill it, because in the 1920s, America had the Great Depression, and the ships were not sailing full any longer. And so it was a big gamble. The White Star Line decided that they would cancel the building of the ship by Harland and Wolff in Belfast. All Harland and Wolff ships were building White Star ships, and all the White Star ships had names ending in IC, such as Olympic. The new giant that they were going to build was to be called Oceanic. So they cancelled it and they built two smaller ships instead that ended up being the last two ships ever built for the White Star Line. One was the Georgic and the other was Britannic. Both came out at about 28,000 feet, and they both entered service before the 1930s. That left Cunard. Well, Cunard were not in a happy state then either. Business was falling off. They had decided to build this fabulous ship, which was designed in 1926 by Arthur Davis, and it was going to be built in Scotland. John Browns of Clydebank were going to build this giant. She was intended to be the first liner ever of 1,000 feet in length. She was going to be the fastest ship in the world, and she was numbered 534 at John Brown's shipyards on the Clyde. The keel was laid in December 1930. She was to be the first of two giant ships of over 1,000 feet in length. The name was kept a secret. It was assumed that she would have a name ending in IA. All Cunard liners had names ending in IA, such as Lusitania and Mauretania and Aquitania. So it was assumed that they would have a name of this new giant with the same sort of ending as was traditional for them. Money. money was running out. It was hemorrhaging. And they were very, very confident, Cunard were very confident that even though this great liner was being built in France as a competitor, and even though they knew the French liner was being built with French public money, Cunard thought the same would happen for them. Wouldn't be the first time that Cunard had borrowed money from the government. They borrowed money in the beginning of 1904, number 5, to build their great Mauretania and Lusitania. And the government were delighted to lend them money to build these great, iconic ships for Britain. But in the mid-1920s, Britain was also going through a terrible financial period. And when Cunard went to the government and said, we're running out of money, 534 is being built and we haven't enough to complete her, we need to borrow money. And the government at that time said, on your bike. We are not in the mood at the moment to lend you public money to build a gilded barge for the rich and famous. Find it somewhere else or cancel it. So this great hull in Scotland was left for over 2.5 years because there was no money to build it. The building of a great ocean liner for a nation doesn't just depend on a shipyard. It is a national event. Industry throughout the nation is also employed in building. You're virtually creating a floating village. The steel has to be created. The glass has to be created. The wood has to be found. Carpets have to be woven. Thousands and thousands of yards of carpet. Electricity has to be created and electric items have to be manufactured. Clocks, ovens, knives and forks and spoons and cups, bed linen, bed, all around the nation, they would be busy creating items to go into this great vessel. And with the virtual cancellation of the order, there was great hardship throughout a nation that was already suffering hardship. Thousands of workers at the shipyards around Clydebank were sent home. And they were sitting in their mean little houses with no money coming in. It was dreadful. Eventually, the government was persuaded to lend money to complete 534, but the government came up with their own plan. They said, if we lend you the money to complete 534 and to build a sister ship, it also means that the two great British transatlantic companies have to amalgamate to one. Otherwise, the White Star Line is going to come to us and they will want money to build theirs, and we're not going to do it. So amalgamate, create a new company. And this they did. They finally created a company called Cunard White Star. It was a combined company, and the money then was invested by the government to build and complete this great ship. You may be wondering why I have this photograph of these three ladies. You obviously and probably know who they are. They are two queens and a princess and a baby prince. What are we going to call this new great ocean liner? Well, they had the idea that they cannot name the ship after a great old Roman province like Aquitania or Mauretania. They would give her the name of a queen. They'd give her the name of a queen with a name ending in IA. So it was the plan of Cunard White Star that this great new ship would go to sea with the name of Queen Victoria. Before any British ship can sail with the name of a member of the royal family, that name has to be approved by the monarch. So before they could even announce the name or put the name on the ship, they had to go and get the permission from King George V. The chairman of Cunard White Star knew the king. They used to shoot together in Balmoral or at Sandringham. And he went and asked for an audience with George V. It was granted. And the king said to him, "How is this new ship of yours coming on?" "Oh, wonderful now. Thank you, Your Majesty. Your government has loaned us the money. We're ready for launching almost, and we would like your permission to name our new ship after Britain's greatest queen." And the king said, "My wife would be delighted." So Queen Mary it was to become. And Queen Mary it was to be, and Queen Mary took the name, and it was fantastic. So here we have Her Majesty Queen Mary on the left, in the middle Princess Elizabeth, and Queen Elizabeth, the consort of the next king, George VI. Queen Mary, of course, was the consort of George V. And the lady in the middle eventually became a queen herself, our Queen Elizabeth. The baby is Prince Charles. The world moves on. The world had stopped in 1931, and for 2 years that great Cunarder sat on the slipway. She was finally launched and named for herself by Queen Mary in September 1934. This is what it looked like. 1,000 feet in length, 118 feet wide, ready to be launched into the Clyde and ready to be named and launched by the Queen. It was the first time that the voice of Queen Mary had been heard by the British public. Noise, please. Oh, okay. We didn't have the sound up.
And now the 40,000-ton hull of the Royal Mail steamer Queen Mary glides down the slipway, cheered all the way by 250,000 people. As the 2,500 tons of drag chains take up the strain. Surely a tribute to British engineering is the fact that without the slightest hitch, the launch is accomplished.
Well, you too did not hear the voice of Queen Mary. What she actually said was, "I am happy to name this ship Queen Mary. May God bless her and all who sail in her." And I don't get any royalties of imitating Queen Mary. And there she is, the great ship launched, the second largest moving structure on the planet. The first had been Normandy. Finally, thousands of shipyard workers were able to stream on to this floating hull. And when a ship is launched, it is only the hull that is launched. It is not a ship as such yet, even though it has a name and it is going to go onto the registry of British ships. She would be the largest ship in the British Empire, and she was going to be the symbol of the great British Empire. Here is a painting done by Charles Peers. It is correct in every detail. It's a very large watercolor, and it is in the Maritime Museum of Greenwich. It is exactly historically correct. Queen Mary is entering Southampton for the first time, and on the left is the then, up to that time, the largest British ship, a White Star ship, the Majestic, withdrawn from service as most White Star ships had been after the merger. The artist has placed the men who built the ships, representing those men, as the center of his picture. And these men all built ships in the great shipyards of Britain. In Scotland, England, and in Northern Ireland, they built ships dressed like this. They didn't have any clothing or safety. And another anomaly in this particular painting is that the ship is coming into Southampton, and I don't think Charles Pearce finished the painting, because nowhere is the name on it. And of course, by this time, the name Queen Mary was on the ship. What did she look like? Massive, majestic, impressive. 3 great funnels, each of those funnels worked. She was a great steamship, slightly old-fashioned, funnily enough, at the time she came into service. She didn't look ultra-modern or art modern as Normandy was. Normandy was already sailing the Atlantic. Normandy already had the Blue Ribbon as the fastest ship in the world, and Queen Mary was ready to win the Blue Ribbon of the Atlantic. And when the director of the White Star and the Cunard White Star were asked, is Queen Mary going to go for the Blue Ribbon of the Atlantic? His answer, very po-faced, was, we do not build our ships to run races. She is the slowest and the smallest ship we could think of for the work intended for her. It was a very stupid answer, as you will hear a little bit later. Queen Mary herself went down to Southampton to visit her ship before it went on her maiden voyage. By this time, she was the Queen Mother. Her husband, George V, had died, and her son was on the throne, tentatively, Edward VIII. And she went to Southampton and boarded her ship with the new king. Some of the items on the ship had been presented by her. They had done not a portrait, but a bas relief of the Queen. It was in the main hall, and she had also presented the ship with her personal standard. When she went back to Sandringham, as she always does, she kept a diary, a very taciturn lady with a great idea of what art was supposed to be. She had written in her diary after she had launched the ship in Scotland. It was a terrible day, actually. And she went back home to Balmoral and she wrote, today I named the biggest ship in the world. I gave her my name. It rained. And after she had visited the ship in Southampton, she went back to Sandringham and she wrote, today I toured my ship, Queen Mary. Not as bad as I feared. And here it is. Artists loved this ship. Her maiden voyage was a national event. They absolutely went mad about it. In 1935, she went on her maiden voyage.
Hearts will glow with admiration when our new liner leaves the quay, and a name loved by the nation will give her charm and dignity. British labor gave its kiss.
Are you going to try for the Blue Ribbon, Captain?
Well, naturally, that's what we're out for. What did we build her for?
I booked my trip for the USA, so when I go over the sea, the Queen Mary takes me.
The coming of the Queen Mary inaugurates one of the greatest races of all time. Which ship will turn out to be the faster, the Normandy or the Queen? That is the question of the hour.
Americans, for all their critical attitude, have a very genuine affection for the old country. And I believe they are delighted to see Britain challenging again for her old supremacy in the passenger traffic of the Atlantic. What a marvelous spectacle is the mass of New York City, clustered at the south tip of Manhattan Island. York is lucky in being a seaport at the terminus of the world's greatest ocean route. Thus, the greatest ships in the world pass right up her river under the shadow of the skyscrapers.
Wonderful. A great ocean liner on a maiden voyage in the old days arriving in New York was a world event. Thousands of tugs and boats and ships all yelling and all blowing their sirens. Queen Mary did not win the blue ribbon of the Atlantic on her maiden voyage. She didn't take it from Normandy. She was doing very well, but there was a fog and they slowed down, and it took quite a few months before Queen Mary finally got the prize. They got the prize in November 1936, and then Normandy got it back. Then Queen Mary got it back, then Normandy got it back, and it was tit for tat, and it was world news. Eventually, Queen Mary won it and kept it for 22 years, a little over 22 years. And she only lost the blue ribbon of the Atlantic in 1952 when the great American liner United States took it from her. But what was Queen Mary like inside? Well, magnificent. Normandy was stupendous. Queen Mary was magnificent. She was known as the ship of rare woods. This is the shopping mall on Queen Mary, the first time a shopping mall had ever been placed on a ship. And they had high street shops, W.H. Smith's. They had the Scotch Wool House. They had a branch, I think, of the Midland Bank. And of course, they did have the ship's shop selling the most amazing souvenirs in those days, gold and silver, butterfly wings. You wouldn't have a butterfly wing on anything these days, of course, and leather goods, ships, clocks, names on it, wonderful things. The restaurant on Queen Mary was actually the largest internal room ever on any ocean liner. It was even bigger than the restaurant on Normandy. The restaurant on Queen Mary, the first-class restaurant, she carried 3 classes of passenger. The restaurant ran the entire width of the ship. It was 118 feet wide. It was 118 feet long, and in the center of the dome, it was 3 decks in height. And as I said, it was lined in rare woods. The forests of the British Empire had been scoured to find rare woods to come to Scotland to go on the ship. So impressive were the woods, so proud were they that they had put so many woods from the British Empire that they had a little booklet. And a booklet was in every first-class cabin, and it was from A to Z and describing all the wood that was on the ship. You could go around the ship and see if you could recognize them. Acero, angelum, ash, abadir, beech, betula, birch, bubinga, cedar, cherry, chestnut, ebony, elm, mahogany, macaw, maple, myrtle, oak, paddock wood, peroba, rosewood, satinwood, sycamore, teak, walnut, yew, and zebrano. It was all there if you could recognize it. The designers of the interior of Queen Mary were in-house designers from Scotland. They were the designers that had designed all the great ships that were built by John Barnes of Clydebank. They were wonderful, top quality. Taste? Well, one wonders. The French laughed. The French sniggered. They said, oh my God, look at this. Whoever puts that pattern of carpet and a different pattern of curtain and a completely different patterns of upholstery in this room? It looks like a provincial hotel in England. Well, so it was in its own way. It was cozy. Queen Mary had a massive coziness. Passengers absolutely loved it. She was comfortable. And she made money from the beginning. Normandy never made a penny profit in its life. And Queen Mary was, without doubt, the most popular ship on the Atlantic, even though perhaps she wasn't the most impressive. She didn't have a cinema. Normandy did. Cinema shows, moving picture were showed in the lounge as if you were in a country house. They moved the chairs, they moved the tables, they moved the sofas in a row, and you watched movies. Queen Mary was built without any handholds anywhere on the ship. The builders, the designers were completely convinced that a ship of such a size would conquer the oceans. She would hardly move. Well, brilliant men can sometimes be stupid. And when Queen Mary met her first big Atlantic gale and started to roll, and this ship could roll and roll and roll, they said she would roll the milk out of a teacup. She rolled, and the furniture moved, and the passengers moved, and they were rolling around like bowling balls. The captain ordered everybody to their cabins until the storm died down, and Queen Mary virtually destroyed her own interior. She had to go back in Southampton, go into dry dock, and it cost them a fortune to redo it, and then they had to put handrails everywhere. How can you build a ship without any handrails in any of the corridors? Nevertheless, they did that because they were convinced. Well, the further out to sea you go, and no matter how big your ship is, it becomes a cork. Art. Well, the artists that created the interior were the finest in Britain. They were Art Deco, Art Moderne artists. They were fine, fabulous in fact, but not quite up to the international standard of the French. We had Cedric Morris and Doris and Anna Zinkeisen, Duncan Grant, Edward Wadsworth, Kenneth Shoesmith, Charles Peirce, MacDonald Gill, Vanessa Bell, and Dame Laura Knight. All created wonderful works of art. This one here is by Edward Wadsworth. It's a surreal painting, and I think it's wonderful. It's still on the ship. You can visit the ship. She is in Long Beach, California. And this is the bas relief that would open up, and you would have movies showing in this room. Enormous room, huge height, vast lamps made out of alabaster, an alabaster big, huge fireplace. And there's a photograph somewhere of, what's his name, Goldwyn from the movie. And Goldwyn was photographed standing next to this fireplace, and he looked tiny in comparison. Bellboys. Little bellboys, butter wouldn't melt in their mouths. They looked 12, 13, but they had to be at least 16 years old. They flitted around the ship. They opened doors, they delivered messages, they operated elevators, and they were tipped. They were tipped prodigiously by Americans. Americans crossing the Atlantic with their dollars hadn't the faintest idea what a British pound was and what it was supposed to be worth, and 12 pence and 202 cents. They hadn't the faintest idea. So they would tip these young men for opening a door, a $5, and they thought it was a $5 bill or a couple of pounds or something. The last captain of Queen Mary was a very dear old friend of mine, John Treasure Jones, and I used to hear the most wonderful stories. And he used to say to me, you know, Ken, the captains and the commodores of Cunard never made any money, no big money. And when I used to arrive back in Southampton, I would change out of uniform, I'd get into mufti, I'd get on my bicycle, and I would cycle home. He lived just outside Southampton. And he'd say, when I was driving out of the gates, I would be passed by Lagondas and MGs, Jaguars, all being driven by my stewards and my bellboys. A gilded barge for the rich and famous. Well, it was, but it was more than that. And here, designing, creating, decorating, the greatest observation bar and lounge, I think, on any ship, Normandy excluded. Wonderful, beautiful room. And here it is, still exists. The whole curvature of her superstructure in this wonderful room with red leather, red lacquer, silvered bronze, fabulous paintings. This was a room for elegance crossing the Atlantic. And of course, they had the nightclub on the ship, the grill room, beautiful room. You could go and order grills, you could dance, they had a little orchestra. It was a pure nightclub. It was more famous than Quaglino's or the Stork Club. You could hardly ever get a table. If you boarded the ship and you wanted a table in the grill room, it was already booked. And many American millionaires booked a table in the grill room of Queen Mary years in advance and paid for it. It was 10 shillings. Made no difference to them. They were millionaires. If they didn't turn up, the table was then released. But that was the great room on Queen Mary. And there it is. Elegant black carpet, oh la la, black carpet, and red velvet curtains with stars. How elegant was that? And they'd charge you, I says, 10 shillings to have a table and for your dinner, extra, and you could have grills and fish, whatever it is you wanted, and this room stayed open for as long as you wanted, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. The swimming pool. Oh, swimming pool on Queen Mary, I think, was even greater than that on Normandy. It was over 2.5 decks in height. The ceiling was all done in crushed mother of pearl. On the port side, you would have the beauty parlors and the saunas and massage rooms for men. On the other side, you would have the equivalent for the females. Anybody who was anybody would go in for a swim in Queen Mary's pool, and it was heated water. Even Johnny Weissmuller, Tarzan, used to dive into the pool, and the girls on the ship would know he was there, and they'd say, "Tarzan's in the pool," and they would run, and I hope he didn't try it because there's no water in it. A writing room with post box. You could write a letter, you'd have an envelope, you'd address it, you'd buy a stamp from the writing room steward, and you'd post it. It was said that Beatrice Lilly, a comedienne, a very famous comedienne in Britain, at that time she was married, I think, to a member of the aristocracy, and she was Lady Peel. She was overheard saying, "Excuse me, I've just posted my letter. Will it arrive in New York tomorrow?" "I'm sorry, no, ma'am. It'll get there when we get there next Wednesday." Woods, cabins, suites, no air conditioning, no stabilizers, no radar at that time. You had what was known as the Punka-Louvre system. Warmed air or cooled air, all. You couldn't arrange the temperature. Used to come blazing out of these things on the side, and you could swivel them around. Your steward would say, "Do not have that pointing towards you in your bed, even though you may be wanting to cool off. Direct it to the ceiling and let it diffuse, otherwise you won't be able to use your neck in the morning." But they had wonderful cabins and suites and cabins deluxe, and you could virtually book an apartment. They were not up to the standard of Normandy. They were pure luxury, of course. They were wonderful. And cabin class, second class. Well, this is the second class, cabin class main lounge. As big and as wonderful and as luxurious as any other first class accommodation on any other ship on the Atlantic. And this was tourist class. The little tourist class lounge forward with wickerwork seats, 1 deck in height, the tourist class shop where you could buy anything. And I crossed to America at the age of 17 on Queen Mary. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful experience as far as I was concerned, and this was my lounge. And my steward once said to me, "You're very lucky you're here at this time of year." It was May 1951. That's a long time ago. And he says, "When this ship is in a gale and she's pitching, you cannot sit on that seat all the time. The ship rises and falls some 60 feet and you levitate." So in the early 1950s, you could be weightless on the Queen Mary. The war came. And like everything else in a nation, it goes to war. It goes to fight a war for your nation. Queen Mary, and at that time her sister, were converted to troopships. First of all, they went from Australia. What a voyage that was on an unair-conditioned ship. But she went from Australia to Egypt, carrying Australians and New Zealand soldiers. But eventually, when the war progressed and America came into the war and they were preparing for the invasion of Europe, their army had to be moved to Europe. And the two queens were used to bring the ships across and the men across to Europe. All other great ships sailed in convoys for safety. The queens never sailed in a convoy. They were a convoy in themselves. They relied on their speed. They could go at over 34 knots. And they zigzagged across the Atlantic. And at the height of the build-up, each of those great ships would carry 16,000 men on each crossing. Unbelievable amounts. Winston Churchill, at the end of the war, said the war was reduced by many months because of these two ships being able to carry so many people at one point. Hitler decreed that any submarine commander who would sink either of the queens would immediately be given a fortune, would become a hero of Nazi Germany, and would be given the Iron Cross. They had been noticed a few times, but they could never be caught. And only once did Queen Mary have a horrendous misfortune. These are the first-class living areas converted to bunks for the soldiers, 3 and 4 in height. Each soldier had a bunk for 8 hours. Each bunk would sleep 3 soldiers in a 24-hour period. They had 2 main meals a day. Thousands of tons of potatoes were peeled and thousands of dozens of eggs were boiled. Nobody went without food. By this time, medical science had produced an anti-seasickness remedy, Dramamine. Otherwise, thousands and thousands of soldiers would arrive at the battlefield seasick. So they needed. War is horrendous. War is terrible. But because of war, many, many new inventions are created before their time out of necessity. One was, of course, medicine, and the other, of course, was radar. And here, Queen Mary zigzagging across the Atlantic, painted grey, they all were. They weren't escorted across the Atlantic, but ships would come out from Londonderry in Northern Ireland, which was in the war. Southern Ireland was neutral during the Second World War. They couldn't use their ports. And little ships would come out to escort the ships to their harbour in Scotland. The end product of their voyages was always Holyloch in Scotland. And at one point, a little light cruiser, HMS Curaçao, was sent out from Londonderry to escort Queen Mary to Scotland. Queen Mary was forging ahead at 30, 32, 33 knots, zigging and zagging all the way to avoid U-boats. And the little Curacao was busting her gut trying to get 31 knots to keep up with her. They were zigging, they were zagging, and in one horrendous moment, one zigged and the other zagged, and Queen Mary cut right through this little warship. 340 British sailors were killed. There were very, very few survivors. They couldn't stop to pick up anybody. Queen Mary was under orders not to stop for anything. She had 16,000 troops. And this was the only damage done to the bow of the great Queen Mary, having cut right through a British warship. It was repaired, and she had a bump in her nose for the rest of her life. Eventually, in the 1960s, she was withdrawn from service. They couldn't afford to keep them. The great queens were crossing the Atlantic in the winter, and the great aircraft were now flying the Atlantic carrying more passengers. And in the winter, the queens were crossing the Atlantic with maybe 65 or 70 first-class passengers. The huge rooms were subdivided, and you had 200 stewards looking after them. It couldn't go on. Money was hemorrhaging, and Queen Mary was finally sold, and she went on her last final voyage, not owned by Cunard White Star at this period, but by her new owners. And she went on one final voyage around Cape Horn, the largest ocean liner, largest ship with the most souls aboard ever to go around Cape Horn. It was a hell of a voyage. There was no air conditioning. It was hot, terrible, but it was an adventure, and it was wonderful. Queen Mary arrived around Cape Horn to Long Beach to an incredible greeting. I was living in Los Angeles at that point, and Captain Treasure Jones invited me to go to Long Beach for the last day that Queen Mary was a ship. It was wonderful. Today, ships go around Cape Horn all the time. Even Queen Mary II, much larger than the original, goes around Cape Horn. I went around Cape Horn and Queen Mary II. I went around it 4 times. Captain brought us around. The weather was so good. He says, now you know you've been around Cape Horn. It was wonderful. A lot of the magic is going out of modern world. Nevertheless, that was Queen Mary, and there she is in Long Beach today. You can go and visit her. Wasn't the end of the queens, of course. A new queen had to be built. Queen Elizabeth. No controversy over the name. By this time, George VI was on the throne. His wife was Queen Elizabeth. And there it is, bigger even than the Queen Mary. The Queen Elizabeth was 83,000 tons, 1,031 feet long and 118 feet wide. Just that much larger, just that much more modern. They'd learned from Normandy. An awful lot of what was in Normandy, then they put into the Queen Elizabeth. And here is a wonderful... Look at these little girls.
We proclaim our belief that by the grace of God and by man's patience and goodwill, order may yet be brought out of confusion and peace out of turmoil. With that hope and prayer in our hearts, we send forth upon her mission this noble ship.
Those 2 little girls, Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret Rose, September 1938, and today little Princess Elizabeth is Elizabeth II and in her 92nd, 93rd year and still our monarch. Incredible. Queen Elizabeth was completed. Queen Elizabeth was painted grey. The war had started after that, and the government gave orders, Queen Elizabeth has to leave Scotland immediately without trials, get her to America as fast as possible. And so the brand new Queen Elizabeth, the largest ocean liner in the world, zigzagged across the Atlantic without having any trials, and including passengers aboard were some of the shipyard workers from John Brown's of Clydebank who were not given the opportunity of leaving the ship. So they arrived in New York and eventually had to be brought home. But there she is, the great Queen Elizabeth, leaving Scotland. She too became a troop ship. She too carried 16,000 troops. It was the most unusual maiden voyage entry into New York. A Navy blimp was flying over when they noticed this great ship, and he radioed down, "I see a huge ship approaching the Hudson. I think it is the new Queen Elizabeth. She's dressed in grey, like an empress fleeing her enemies." I doubt if anybody actually wrote that, but I think it's very nice. And here, in Manhattan, for the first and only time, the three greatest ships in the world docked together. The brand new Queen Elizabeth with her two funnels in the lower. In the middle, her great sister, three funnels looking even smaller, but not much, Queen Mary. And next to her, the giant of all, the great Normandy that never ever leaves that dock. And at the very top, the second Mauritania that was only been a few months old when the war broke out. And here is Queen Elizabeth with her crowd of soldiers, like bees in a hive. The only time they met at sea was off Sydney Heads in Australia in the early 1940s. Churchill went on both ships to New York and then on to Washington to meet Roosevelt. Two suites in each of those ships were kept exactly as they had been before the war, just for Churchill and his cabinet. And here, finally, at the end of the war, Queen Elizabeth is at last painted in Cunard colors. She is filled with her furniture, and she's ready to go on her first passenger maiden voyage. The Queen came down from London to sail a little way out on her ship. She went as far, I think, as Portsmouth, and there she was brought ashore. And here, the interiors of the Queen Elizabeth. Larger, less comfortable, people said, than Queen Mary. A little bit grander, I think, in this wonderful portrait of the Queen in her fabulous gown. And here, some of the great interiors of the Queen Elizabeth. The elevators, each one had an elevator operator. The bedrooms, first class, all looked like stars' dressing rooms in a great theatre. The largest library on a ship up to that point. And the Queen Elizabeth did have her first cinema. It wasn't a full theatre, but in fact it was a theatre. And some of the rooms by this time were air-conditioned. Eventually they put stabilizers on both queens, but at the beginning they never had any stabilizers. This is some of the wonderful woodwork. This is second class, smoke room, leather walls, beautiful room. And the great bow of Queen Elizabeth looking out over Southampton. Eventually, Queen Elizabeth too had to be withdrawn from service. She was sold to an organization who wanted to do with her in Florida as had been done with Queen Mary in California. And so Queen Elizabeth went to Florida, didn't stay very long. The company ran out of money. They couldn't afford to keep her, and Cunard took her back. She was then resold to a Chinese entrepreneur called C.Y. Tung. Loved the ship. He wanted the world's largest ship, and he wanted to have her as a university and as a museum. So he renamed the ship It was a play on his words. His name was C.Y. Tung, and he changed the name to C.Y.'s University. He employed her last Commodore to bring the ship to Hong Kong. Ship was in a terrible condition. It took forever, but they finally got it to Hong Kong. And there in Hong Kong, he rebuilt his wonderful ship. He was a multimillionaire. He didn't need to have an insurance scam. But there, just before she was completed, the great Queen Elizabeth accidentally went on fire. It was discovered that it was the Tongs in Hong Kong who decided that they wanted to delay the completion of the ship until after the Chinese New Year, so they would start a little fire. They were a little bit too diligent, and they started 14 fires. And here, the great bridge of Queen Elizabeth, state of the art at that point. If you looked at the bridge even today on Aurora, we are like the Starship Enterprise in comparison. And here, at the very end of the ocean liner era, New York finally, at the final lump, the bottom, second Mauritania, then Queen Elizabeth, then the Georgic, Liberté, and above that, the great Speed Queen, United States, and beyond her, the little Italian liner, Conte Biancamano. And here, C.Y.'s University with the name Queen Elizabeth, you can see just above it, looking in a terrible state. And finally, this wonderful ocean liner went on fire. They couldn't put it out. She burnt herself out. She turned over, and she too ended up under the waters of Hong Kong. She, as like the Normandy, had given themselves Vikings' funerals, burning to death. Wasn't the end, actually. Cunard White Star, at this point just called Cunard again, built a third queen, the QE2, Queen Elizabeth II. It was named and launched by the then monarch, Queen Elizabeth, who went to Scotland and said, "This ship should not be named after me. I am not Queen Elizabeth II of Scotland. I think we should name this ship after my mother's ship." So the QE2, in fact, was named for a ship. She is out of service now, sadly, the last few years, and she is a hotel in Dubai. My companion on this trip went and stayed on it on his way from Australia, and he stayed on the Queen Elizabeth in Dubai and says it's absolutely fabulous. I thought it would have been the absolute end of it, but it wasn't. And then Cunard became owned by Carnival, and Carnival decided they wanted the biggest ocean liner in the world, so they built a new queen, Queen Mary II. There she is, not as pretty as the original, but a massive, unbelievable ocean liner, the only remaining Royal Mail ship in the British fleet. And then they built, finally, a Queen Victoria. Wonderful. And a few years later, they built a Queen Elizabeth. And Her Majesty the Queen named for the first time a great ocean liner and gave it her name. They are now building a fourth queen. A name hasn't been picked yet. She won't be ready for a couple of years. I have suggested it should be called the Queen Alexandra, which would be beautiful. But who knows? She may come out as the Queen Camilla. Ladies and gentlemen, the story of ships, the queens of the Atlantic. Tomorrow I'll be talking to you again. I'm talking about the end of the ocean liner era. I hope you can come. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.